The August heat pressed against the stone walls of Villa Mondragon like a living thing. 35 kilometers southeast of Rome, the former Jesuit college sat empty that afternoon in 1912, its corridors thick with the smell of old paper and Mediterranean dust. Wilfrid Voynich climbed the narrow stairs to the library, his expensive suit rumpled from travel, his hands trembling slightly in a way they hadn't since his years in a Russian prison. The Jesuit librarian, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, led him past shelves of catalogued manuscripts toward a corner where forgotten things accumulated. "There's a chest here," the librarian said in Italian, his tone suggesting this was a waste of time. "Old medical texts, mostly ruined. Water damage from the roof. Nobody's looked at them in decades." Voynich spoke 7 languages fluently, a skill that had kept him alive through revolution and exile. He understood the librarian's dismissive tone perfectly, but he hadn't built his rare book business in London by ignoring the forgotten corners. The chest itself was unremarkable, wooden and salt-damaged, its hinges stiff with rust. When he pried open the lid, the smell hit him first. Not mold, as he'd expected, but something cleaner, almost medicinal, centuries compressed into air molecules. The manuscripts inside were wrapped in cloth that crumbled at his touch. Most were damaged beyond value, Latin medical treatises eaten by moisture and time. Then his fingers found something different. The vellum felt wrong the moment he touched it. Too smooth, too heavy for its apparent age. He lifted the manuscript carefully, aware of the librarian watching with that particular Italian expression that meant he'd seen book dealers come and go. The cover was simple leather, worn but intact. When Voynich opened it, the pages moved with a whisper that made his breath catch. The script was beautiful, precise, confident. Characters that looked almost like letters he should recognize, arranged in words that felt tantalizingly close to meaning. He turned the page. And another. His polyglot mind raced through possibilities: Latin, medieval German, coded Hebrew, cipher Latin, abbreviated medical terminology. Nothing matched. The botanical drawings began on the 4th page. Plants rendered in brilliant colors that shouldn't have survived 6 centuries in a damp chest. Blue and green and ochre, depicting stems and leaves and flowers with scientific precision. Voynich had sold enough medieval herbals to recognize quality botanical illustration. These were exceptional. Each plant drawn with careful attention to root structure, leaf arrangement, flowering patterns. But something was profoundly wrong with them. The proportions weren't quite right. Flowers that grew directly from leaves, root systems that spiraled impossibly, plants that looked real enough to touch but couldn't possibly exist. He turned more pages, faster now, his academic training overriding his dealer's instinct to move slowly with valuable things. 240 pages, everyone covered in the same confident, unreadable script. More botanical drawings. Then astronomical charts that made no sense. Wheels within wheels, celestial patterns that matched no system he knew. Diagrams of naked women in green pools, connected by tubes to strange vessels. Sections that looked like pharmaceutical recipes, if recipes could be written in a language that didn't exist. "How long has this been here?" Voynich asked, his voice steadier than his hands. The librarian shrugged. "Since 1666, according to the inventory. It came from Prague, I think. Or maybe Vienna. The records aren't clear. Nobody's ever wanted it. Can't read it, can't value it." He smiled thinly. Probably some monk's elaborate joke. A lifetime wasted making nonsense. Voynich's finger traced the script on one page. The ink was dark, consistent, professional. This wasn't the work of a bored monk doodling in margins. This was systematic, intentional. The handwriting never wavered, never rushed. Someone had written this with absolute confidence, as if they knew exactly what they were saying. "I'll take the chest," Voynich said. "All of it, 30 pounds. The librarian's eyebrows rose. "For water-damaged Latin and a book of gibberish?" "Call it a speculation." When he left Villa Mondragone that evening, the manuscript wrapped carefully in oilcloth, Voynich felt the particular thrill that came from either brilliant discovery or catastrophic mistake. There was rarely middle ground in his profession. This would either make him wealthy beyond his modest hopes or prove the final waste of capital he couldn't afford to lose. That night in his Roman hotel room, he spread the pages carefully across the bed and began taking notes. Not about what the manuscript said, he couldn't read a word, but about what it was. The vellum was genuine, certainly medieval. The ink showed no signs of modern chemical composition. The binding was consistent with 15th or 16th century Italian work. Everything about it screamed authenticity, except the content made no sense whatsoever. He thought about his wife, Ethel, waiting in London, a suffragette, fierce and brilliant, who'd married him despite his revolutionary past and persistent financial precarity. She'd understand this gamble. She'd also understand what it would mean if he was wrong. The plants on page 17 looked almost like poppies. Almost. But poppies didn't have leaves that spiraled in 7 directions, or flowers that grew in perfect geometric patterns. Page 33 showed something that might have been a sunflower, if sunflowers grew on vines and had root systems that looked like human organs. Voynich closed the manuscript carefully. Whatever this was, he needed experts. Real experts. The kind who could tell him whether he'd found something priceless or been brilliantly fooled by a Renaissance forger. His tour of Europe began in London. The British Museum's botanical expert, a portly man named Weatherby, who'd spent 40 years cataloging plant specimens from the Empire, spent 3 hours with the manuscript in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wood. He turned pages slowly, his magnifying lens moving across each illustration with methodical precision. Finally, he looked up. "These plants don't exist." "You mean they're extinct?" Voynich asked. "I mean they never existed. Look at this one." He pointed to a drawing of what looked like a sunflower. "The flower structure is botanically impossible, and this, a stem that's hollow and solid simultaneously. This one has leaves growing in a pattern that violates every principle of plant morphology." He closed the manuscript gently. "It's beautiful work, scientifically precise in its impossibility, but these plants are pure fantasy." Next was Cambridge, where a medievalist named Ashwood spent 2 days examining the script itself. Voynich watched him work, noting how the man's confidence slowly dissolved into frustration. Ashwood tried Latin decoding, tested for abbreviation systems, looked for common medieval cipher patterns. "It's not Latin," Ashwood finally said. "Not Greek, not Hebrew, not Arabic, not any European language I know, and I know them all." He paused. "The disturbing thing is it looks like language. See how words repeat? How some combinations appear frequently while others are rare. That's statistical behavior you'd expect from real language, but I cannot identify even one word." The pattern repeated across Europe: Vienna, Paris, Berlin, Prague. Every expert he showed it to went through the same evolution: initial confidence, careful examination, growing puzzlement, and eventual defeated admission that they couldn't help. A renowned cryptographer in Berlin, a man who'd broken commercial codes for the Kaiser's intelligence service, spent a week on it. Whoever created this understood cryptography at a level that shouldn't exist in the medieval period, he said. The statistical properties suggest it's not simple substitution, but beyond that? He spread his hands. "I'm sorry." By the time Voynich returned to London 9 months later, He'd accumulated a file of expert testimonies that all said essentially the same thing. The manuscript appeared to be genuine medieval work, written in a completely unknown language or cipher, illustrating plants that couldn't exist, describing processes that made no sense, and composed with a confidence that suggested the author knew exactly what they were doing. And nobody, anywhere, could read a single word of it. He sat in his London office late one night, the manuscript open on his desk, and allowed himself to acknowledge the fear that had been growing since Villa Mondragon. What if this wasn't a discovery? What if it was a trap? Not a physical trap, but something more subtle. A puzzle designed to consume anyone who tried to solve it. A beautiful, impossible thing that promised answers but delivered only obsession. Then he pushed the thought away and returned to his notes. He'd devoted too much already to turn back now. The theory, when it finally came, seemed obvious in retrospect. If the manuscript resisted linguistic analysis, perhaps it was never meant to be read as language at all. Perhaps it was cipher, a code, a deliberately encrypted text waiting for the right key to unlock it. The idea took hold across the small community of scholars now aware of the manuscript. If it was cipher, what kind? Who could break it? The question became particularly urgent in 1914, as war consumed Europe and cryptography suddenly became a matter of life and death. But the war came and went, and the manuscript stayed closed. It wasn't until William Friedman arrived that the world's greatest cryptographic minds directly confronted what would come to be called the Voynich Manuscript. Friedman had broken Japanese codes during World War II. He'd created the cryptographic systems that protected American military communications. If anyone could crack an old medieval cipher, it should have been him. In 1944, while Enigma machines were falling to Allied codebreakers across Europe, Friedman assembled a team to study the manuscript now housed at Yale's Voynich Library. They were the best cryptographers in the world, fresh from successes that had helped win the war. The Voynich Manuscript, they figured, would be a pleasant academic exercise. A way to prove that no code, no matter how old or clever, could withstand modern cryptographic analysis. They were wrong. The team worked for months, then years. They applied every technique that had broken Nazi communications. They used the latest computational tools, primitive by later standards, but cutting-edge for 1945. They analyzed letter frequency, word patterns, statistical distributions. They tested for substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, polyalphabetic ciphers, every system known to cryptographic science. Nothing worked. What made it worse was that the manuscript didn't behave like a fake. Random gibberish had different statistical properties than language. The Voynich text showed all the statistical signatures of real communication. Word length distribution that matched natural language, repeating patterns that suggested grammar, clear structural organization into sentences and paragraphs. It looked like language the way water looked like water. They just couldn't identify which language, or any language. Friedman eventually concluded that if it was a cipher, it was unlike any system his team had encountered. More disturbing was the growing suspicion that perhaps it wasn't cipher at all. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Something that mimicked language without being language. Information encoded in a way that human cryptography simply wasn't equipped to recognize. He never solved it. None of them did. By the time Friedman abandoned the project in the 1970s, he'd spent nearly 3 decades on and off studying the manuscript. 3 decades of the world's greatest cryptographic mind, and he couldn't read a single word. The same text that had defeated medieval scholars and Victorian linguists had now defeated the men who broke Enigma. The manuscript sat in Yale's climate-controlled vault, perfectly preserved, absolutely impenetrable. Wilfrid Voynich had died in 1930, still believing he might have wasted 18 years on an elaborate hoax. But the manuscript survived him. It survived all of them. And it continued to wait, silent and patient, for someone to either solve its mystery or finally understand why it couldn't be solved. Dr. Lisa Fagan Davis first heard about the Voynich Manuscript during a particularly tedious faculty meeting in 2015. Someone mentioned it in the context of medieval cryptography, and she'd dismissed it with the kind of professional contempt that academics reserve for subjects they consider beneath serious scholarship. "The Voynich obsession is intellectual masturbation," she'd said, earning a few uncomfortable laughs. "People spend decades on it because they can't accept that some medieval scribe probably got bored and drew nonsense. Meanwhile, we have thousands of actual readable manuscripts gathering dust in archives because everyone wants to chase the sexy mystery." At 45, Davis had built her reputation on careful scholarship and methodical thinking. Executive director of the Medieval Academy of America, published author, respected voice in manuscript studies. She had 2 teenage kids, a patient husband named Michael, and a firm belief that the field's resources were better spent on manuscripts that could actually be read. The Voynich Manuscript, in her professional opinion, was a distraction. A beautiful, elaborate distraction that sucked in amateurs and conspiracy theorists and convinced them they were doing scholarship. Then her colleague at Yale, a curator named Sandra Chen, sent her an email with the subject line, "You need to see this in person." Davis almost deleted it. She'd been to Yale's Benecke Library dozens of times. She'd seen their Gutenberg Bible, their medieval medical texts, their illuminated manuscripts. What could possibly require a special trip? But Sandra was persistent. "I know your position on the Voynich," she wrote. "But humor me. Come look at it with fresh eyes, not to solve it, just to see it. As a medievalist, not a codebreaker." Davis went on a Thursday afternoon in October, telling Michael she'd be home by dinner. The drive from Boston to New Haven took 2 hours through autumn foliage that she barely noticed, mentally preparing her lecture notes for the following week. Sandra met her in the main reading room, a space of honey-colored marble and filtered light. "Thanks for coming. I promise this isn't a setup to convert you into a Voynich person." "Good, because I value our friendship." They descended to the basement levels where the climate-controlled vault held the library's most valuable manuscripts. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, and Davis's breath formed small clouds as they passed through security checkpoints. This was where Yale kept things that couldn't risk exposure to uncontrolled environments. The manuscript waited on a specialized examination table, resting in a custom foam cradle designed to support the vellum's weight without creating pressure points. Davis approached it with the careful attention she gave all medieval books, noting first the binding, then the pages visible through the protective covering. Sandra handed her cotton gloves. "Standard protocols. You can turn pages, but slowly." Davis pulled on the gloves and lifted the protective cover. The first thing that struck her was the vellum's texture. She'd handled hundreds of medieval manuscripts, and each had its own feeling. Parchment from different animals, different tanning processes, different ages all had distinctive qualities. This felt wrong. Not wrong in the sense of fake, but wrong in the sense that it didn't match any vellum she'd encountered. Too smooth, almost waxy, as if the material itself resisted aging. She turned to the first page of text, and despite all her skepticism, despite her professional dismissal of Voynich obsessives, she felt her stomach tighten. The script was extraordinary, not beautiful in the artistic sense, though it had a certain elegance, but extraordinary in its confidence. Whoever wrote this had no hesitation, no corrections, no marginal notes indicating uncertainty. Each character was formed with absolute precision. The spacing was perfect. The lines were straight. She turned another page, then another. The botanical illustrations appeared, and Davis stopped breathing for a moment. She'd spent years studying medieval herbals. She knew the conventions, the artistic limitations, the ways medieval illustrators depicted plants they'd actually seen versus plants described in ancient texts. These illustrations didn't follow any of those patterns. "These look like photographs," she murmured. "What?" "The detail level. Medieval illustrators usually stylized. They worked from memory or description. These are too precise, too anatomically correct, except—" She pointed to a plant that looked like a sunflower crossed with something that couldn't exist. "Except they're depicting things that never existed." Sandra nodded. "And that's just the botanical section. Wait until you see the astronomical charts." Davis spent the next 3 hours examining the manuscript with increasing unease. As an academic exercise, it was fascinating. As a physical object, it was deeply disturbing. Everything about it screamed genuine medieval craftsmanship. The vellum, the ink, the binding, the folding patterns, all consistent with 15th century Italian bookmaking. But the content, the impossible, unreadable content. She photographed several pages with the library's specialized equipment, making detailed notes about what she was seeing. Not trying to decode anything, just documenting. The astronomical charts made no sense. The pharmaceutical section, if that's what it was, showed processes that didn't match any medieval medical tradition. And throughout all of it, that confident, unreadable script. "Have you run any computational analysis?" Davis asked. Sandra pulled up a laptop. "This is where it gets really strange. We've digitized the entire manuscript, high-resolution scans of every page, then ran it through every linguistic analysis software available. The screen filled with graphs and statistics, word frequency distributions, character pattern analysis, syntactic structure probability mapping." Davis leaned in, her academic training making sense of the data even as her rational mind rejected what it was showing. "This behaves like language," she said slowly. "Exactly like language. Word length distribution follows Zipf's law, which governs how words appear in natural languages. There are clear patterns suggesting grammatical structure. Words that appear frequently in certain contexts but rarely in others, indicating some kind of syntax. It has all the statistical markers of real communication. But it doesn't match any known language." "Not even close. We've compared it to every language family in human history: Indo-European, Semitic, Sino-Tibetan, Austronesian, everything. No matches. We've tested for artificial languages, constructed languages, even tried seeing if it matched fictional languages from literature." Sandra paused. "It's like someone created something that looks and behaves exactly like language, but isn't any language that humans have ever spoken?" Davis sat back, removing her gloves carefully. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she recognized the feeling. It was the same sensation she'd felt years ago when she first held a genuine medieval manuscript, that awareness of touching something that connected to another time. But this was different. This wasn't connection. This was wrongness. "I need coffee," she said. They went to a cafe near campus, and Davis ordered the strongest espresso they had. Sandra waited patiently while she processed. "Okay," Davis finally said, playing devil's advocate. "What if it's an elaborate hoax? Someone in the Renaissance creates an impressive-looking book with nonsense text and impossible illustrations, sells it or uses it to gain patronage. The mystery is the point, not the content." "That was my theory for years," Sandra replied. "But then you run into problems. First, the statistical properties. How does a Renaissance forger create text that follows linguistic patterns they couldn't possibly have known about? Zipf's law wasn't discovered until 1935. Second, the consistency. 240 pages of maintained nonsense without a single slip into real language? That requires discipline we don't see in known hoaxes. And third, she pulled out her phone and showed Davis an image. Carbon dating. Multiple tests, multiple laboratories. The vellum is genuine 15th century. Davis stared at the data. Professional forgers could fake a lot of things, but carbon dating was hard to fool. So someone in 1420 created a book in an unknown language depicting plants that don't exist. Or, Sandra said carefully, someone created a book that was never meant to be read. Before Davis could respond, her phone rang. Unknown number, but the area code was Washington, D.C. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. Dr. Davis? This is Father Theodore Peterson. I understand you've been examining the Voynich Manuscript. Davis shot Sandra a confused look. How did anyone know she'd been at Yale? I'm sorry, who? I'm a retired professor at Georgetown, cryptography and medieval studies. I spent 25 years working on that manuscript. Sandra Chen is a former student of mine. She mentioned you were coming to look at it. Sandra looked guilty. Davis mouthed, "Really?" at her. Father Peterson, I appreciate the call, but I was just doing a professional courtesy for a colleague. I'm not actually researching the manuscript. Good. Keep it that way. The man's voice was firm, almost harsh. I'm calling because I've seen this pattern before. Respected scholars who think they can just take a quick look, satisfy their curiosity, then move on. It doesn't work that way. I'm not sure I understand. The manuscript doesn't let go. I've watched it destroy careers, marriages, lives. People who swore they'd only spend a month on it ended up spending decades. People who thought they were too smart to get obsessed. He paused. I thought I was too smart. Davis felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. What happened to you? I started seeing patterns that weren't there, convinced myself I was close to solving it. My colleagues tried to warn me. My superiors tried to pull me off the project. I didn't listen. By the time I finally walked away, I'd wasted 25 years. 25 years I could have spent on actual scholarship, actual contributions to human knowledge. But surely the attempt has value. Does it? Peterson's voice was bitter. What did my 25 years accomplish? Nothing. Zero. The manuscript is exactly as unreadable now as it was when I started. Except now I'm an old man with a ruined reputation and a file drawer full of failed theories. Sandra was making placating gestures, suggesting Davis should be diplomatic. But Davis had always preferred honesty. Father Peterson, I appreciate your concern, but I'm a medievalist, not a codebreaker. I was simply examining it as a physical artifact. That's what they all say. His voice softened slightly. Dr. Davis, I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm trying to save you from making the mistake I made. Some puzzles aren't meant to be solved. Some mysteries protect themselves. The Voynich Manuscript has defeated everyone who's ever seriously tried to read it. Everyone. The question you need to ask yourself is, why? The line went dead. Davis sat staring at her phone. Sandra looked uncomfortable. Sorry. I thought maybe hearing from someone who'd been through it might be helpful. Helpful for what? I told you, I'm not working on it. I know, but you were in there for 3 hours. I saw your face. You're hooked. Davis wanted to argue, but the truth was she'd already been mentally rearranging her schedule to make time to come back. Already thinking about who she could call, what databases she could access. The manuscript had gotten under her skin in exactly the way Peterson had warned about. She drove back to Boston in silence, her mind racing through possibilities. That night at dinner, Michael asked how her day had been, and she told him about the manuscript. He listened with the patient attention he'd perfected over 20 years of marriage. So, basically, it's a 500-year-old book that nobody can read? 600, and it's more complicated than that. Is it, though? He smiled gently. Either someone can read it or they can't. And since nobody can, maybe that's the answer. It's not meant to be read. Davis felt irritation flash. That's intellectually lazy. Or intellectually honest. Not everything has to be solved, Lisa. Some things just are. She went to bed angry, though she couldn't articulate why. Michael was probably right. But admitting that felt like giving up, and Davis had never been good at accepting defeat. At 2 a.m, she found herself in her study, looking at the photographs she'd taken at Yale. The script stared back at her, confident and impenetrable. Somewhere in the house, Michael was sleeping peacefully. Their kids were asleep. Her life was balanced, successful, meaningful. She could walk away right now. Never think about the manuscript again. Focus on her actual work, her actual responsibilities. Instead, she opened her laptop and began searching for every scholarly article ever written about the Voynich Manuscript. By sunrise, she'd read 43 papers and filled 3 pages with notes. The manuscript had claimed another victim. She just didn't know it yet. 3 months after her first visit to Yale, Davis had convinced herself she was different from the obsessives. She wasn't trying to solve the manuscript. She was simply documenting it properly, creating a comprehensive catalog of its botanical illustrations for her next book. Academic work, with clear boundaries and reasonable goals. Michael didn't buy it. You were up until 3 again last night. I'm working on a deadline. For a book that didn't exist 4 months ago. He set his coffee down carefully. Lisa, I watched the Peterson call happen. I saw your face when you came home that first night. This isn't research. This is something else. I'm being careful. That's what worries me. Careful people don't need to say they're being careful. But Davis pressed forward, telling herself she was maintaining perspective. She traveled to Yale twice more that winter, each visit lasting longer. She photographed every botanical illustration in high resolution, consulted with plant morphologists at Harvard and MIT. The consensus was unsettling. The plants were too detailed to be pure fantasy. They showed understanding of botanical structure that suggested someone had actually observed similar organisms. It's like they're drawing from life, a botanist named Dr. Sharma told her, squinting at one of the images. See how the leaf venation is consistent throughout? How the root structure follows logical patterns? These aren't imaginative doodles. Someone knew what they were drawing. They just weren't drawing anything from Earth. Davis felt a chill. You're saying they're alien plants? I'm saying whoever drew these had a model. Whether that model existed in reality or in their mind with unusual clarity, I can't tell you. But this level of anatomical consistency doesn't come from random invention. By spring of 2016, Davis had filled 4 notebooks with observations. Her actual work, the responsibilities of her position at the medieval academy, had begun to slip. She delegated more, declined invitations to conferences, stopped returning calls from colleagues. Her study at home had transformed into something between a war room and a shrine. Printouts of manuscript pages covered the walls, connected by red yarn like a detective movie cliché. Michael stood in the doorway one evening, taking in the scene. Lisa, look at yourself. She turned from her desk, genuinely confused. What? You're doing exactly what Peterson did, exactly what Voynich did. You promised yourself you wouldn't, and here you are with red yarn on the walls. I'm not obsessed. I'm being systematic. Obsessed people never think they're obsessed? His voice was gentle but firm. They think they're close to something. They think they're different from all the others who failed. They think just a few more weeks, just a few more tests. Davis wanted to argue, but the words died in her throat, because she had been thinking exactly that. Just a few more weeks until she cracked the botanical code. Just a few more consultations with experts. She was close. She could feel it. Except she wasn't close. She was exactly where everyone else had been, staring at beautiful impossibilities and inventing reasons to keep staring. That night, she made herself read Father Peterson's published papers. Not the conclusions, which she'd skimmed before, but the progression, the evolution of his thinking across 2 decades. What she found made her stomach turn. The early papers from the 1960s were measured, methodical, confident. By the 1970s, they'd become speculative, reaching for patterns that weren't quite there. By the 1980s, his writing had taken on a manic quality, seeing religious symbolism everywhere, connecting the manuscript to medieval mysticism, to ancient heresies, to knowledge that the Church had supposedly suppressed. Then nothing. Just a complete stop in 1989. Sandra had given her a contact number. Davis stared at it for an hour before calling. Peterson answered on the 5th ring. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." "Father Peterson, I've been reading your papers." "Then you've seen the progression, the slow slide from scholarship into madness." He didn't sound bitter anymore, just tired. "Would you like to know what finally broke me?" Davis found she did. Georgetown University, January 1987. Theodore Peterson had been working on the manuscript for 22 years. He was 59 years old, still teaching, but barely. His office looked like Davis's study would come to look. Walls covered in charts, correlations, pattern analysis. His colleagues had stopped inviting him to department meetings. Students avoided his seminars. But Peterson was close. He knew it. The manuscript's text showed patterns that aligned with medieval religious numerology. 7 here, 12 there, 40, all numbers with biblical significance. The astronomical charts, when properly interpreted, revealed a cosmology consistent with Neoplatonic mysticism. The women in the pools, clearly an allegory for the 7 stages of alchemical transformation. He stopped sleeping. Not because he chose to, but because closing his eyes meant stopping the work. 3 days awake, then 4. His hands shook constantly. He'd stopped eating properly, living on coffee and whatever snacks were in the faculty lounge. On the 4th night of his latest wakeful stretch, the manuscript revealed itself. Or he thought it did. He saw it clearly then, perfectly clearly. The text wasn't language at all. It was a map. Not a geographical map, but a spiritual one. Instructions for transforming human consciousness through systematic meditation and mental exercises. The plants were states of mind. The astronomical charts were stages of enlightenment. The women in pools represented the soul being purified through 7 levels of understanding. It was brilliant. It was perfect. It explained everything. He wrote for 18 hours straight, his cramped handwriting filling page after page. The proof, the solution, the answer that had eluded everyone for centuries. When he finished, his hands were bleeding from gripping the pen too hard. He had written 140 pages. Then he slept for 16 hours. When he woke, he read what he'd written. In the cold light of afternoon, in his right mind again, he saw it for what it was. The delusional ravings of an exhausted man who'd stopped thinking clearly weeks ago. There was no solution, no brilliant insight, just desperate pattern matching from a mind that had been pushed past its limits. He gathered all 140 pages, plus the thousands of pages of notes he'd accumulated over 22 years, and shoved them into boxes. Then he walked to his department chair's office and requested a sabbatical. He never returned to the manuscript, not once in the 30 years since. "That's what obsession does," Peterson told Davis over the phone. It makes you think you're seeing clearly when you're actually hallucinating. And the worst part is how good it feels. That moment when you think you've solved it? That's the best feeling I've ever experienced. Better than my ordination. Better than publishing my first book. Better than anything. And then? And then you wake up and realize you've wasted years on nothing. That you've sacrificed relationships, health, career advancement, all for a beautiful lie your mind told itself. Davis sat in silence for a long moment. What if someone could solve it? What if... Dr. Davis. Peterson's voice was sharp. Listen to yourself. You're already talking like I did. What if I'm the one? You're not. Nobody is. Because it's not meant to be solved. How can you know that? Because after 22 years, I understood something. The manuscript doesn't just defeat attempts to read it. It actively resists them. Every time someone thinks they're close, they hit a wall. Every theory that seems promising falls apart under scrutiny. Every pattern dissolves when examined too closely. It's not random chance. It's design. The words hung between them like a revelation Davis had been trying not to acknowledge. You're saying it's deliberately indecipherable. I'm saying it's protecting itself, or protecting us. I'm not sure which. After the call, Davis sat in her study for hours, staring at the walls of manuscript pages, the red yarn connecting botanical drawings to astronomical charts to pharmaceutical recipes. She'd been at this for 6 months and had accomplished exactly nothing. No insights Voynich hadn't had, no progress beyond what Friedman achieved, no understanding deeper than what Peterson had reached before his breakdown. But what if indecipherability was the point? The thought came fully formed, a reframing so complete it made her dizzy. What if the manuscript wasn't meant to be read? What if someone in the 15th century had deliberately created something that looked like knowledge but couldn't be accessed? Information that protected itself by being incomprehensible? She thought about what knowledge might need that kind of protection. What secrets could 15th century people have possessed that were too dangerous to record normally, yet too important to lose completely? Medical knowledge, perhaps. Specifically women's medical knowledge. Contraception, abortion, treatments for female ailments. The kind of information that would get you burned as a witch if recorded in plain text. What if the manuscript was an encrypted medical text, deliberately made impossible to read without the key? The theory felt right in a way nothing else had. It explained the botanical drawings. All those impossible plants might be encoded descriptions of real herbs. It explained the pharmaceutical section. It even explained why carbon dating proved it genuine while the content remained unreadable. Davis threw herself into researching medieval women's medicine with renewed energy. She read everything she could find about historical contraception, about plants used in traditional abortion methods, about healing practices that church authorities had tried to suppress. The more she learned, the more the manuscript seemed to align with her theory. Michael watched this new phase with visible concern. I thought you said you were backing off. This is different. I'm not trying to decode the language. I'm researching the context. Lisa, you're working 14-hour days. You missed Emma's recital. You haven't been to the academy office in 3 weeks. This is important. More important than your actual life. She didn't answer because she wasn't sure anymore. Then, in March of 2017, the breakthrough came. Or appeared to come. A Turkish linguist named Ahmet Ardıç published a paper suggesting the manuscript might be written in a phonetic transcription of Turkish, using symbols to represent sounds rather than meanings. Applied consistently, the first few pages seemed to yield coherent Turkish words about medicinal herbs and female health. Davis read the paper 3 times, her heart racing. This was it, the solution. the proof that her women's medicine theory was correct. She immediately began learning Turkish, cross-referencing Ardich's translations with her botanical research. For 2 weeks, she was euphoric. She'd done it. Where Voynich and Friedman and Peterson had failed, she'd succeeded by looking at context instead of just code. She wrote a preliminary paper, submitted it to 3 journals. The responses came back within days, and they were devastating. The linguistic community tore Ardich's theory apart. Yes, you could get a few Turkish words if you chose your transcription system carefully, but you could get a few words from any language using selective interpretation. The statistical analysis didn't hold up. The grammar broke down after the first few pages. The supposed Turkish words appeared in combinations that made no sense in actual Turkish. It was pareidolia, pattern recognition finding meaning in randomness, the same trap that had caught Newbold in the 1920s, claiming to see Latin hidden in the text. The same trap that had caught Peterson when he saw religious numerology. The same trap that caught everyone. Davis's paper was rejected by all 3 journals. One reviewer was particularly harsh. The author appears to have fallen victim to the common Voynich obsessive pattern, selecting a theory, then cherry-picking evidence that supports it while ignoring contradictory data. This is not scholarship. This is wishful thinking. She read that review sitting in her study at 2 in the morning, surrounded by her research, her theories, her thousands of hours of work. Emma and Jackson were asleep down the hall. Michael was asleep in the bedroom they barely shared anymore. The manuscript pages on her walls seemed to mock her with their confident, unreadable text. Peterson had been right. The manuscript didn't just defeat attempts to read it. It made you believe you were succeeding, right up until the moment it proved you'd been fooling yourself all along. Davis picked up her phone. It was too late to call anyone, but she found herself dialing Peterson's number anyway. He answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting. "You tried to solve it," he said. Not a question. "The Turkish theory, I know what you thought. I've been where you are, staring at pages of notes, realizing you've wasted months or years, wondering how you let it get this far." Davis felt tears she didn't remember starting. "I was so sure. They always are. That's what makes it so dangerous." Peterson's voice was gentle now. "The manuscript makes you feel brilliant for choosing your particular failed approach. It makes you think you're seeing something everyone else missed. And then it shows you that you're just the latest in a long line of intelligent people who convinced themselves they were different." "So what do I do now?" "That depends. Do you want to end up like me, bitter and broken at 80, looking back on decades wasted? Or do you want to choose differently?" Davis looked around her study, at the manuscripts on the walls, at the notebooks full of theories, at the life she'd been ignoring in favor of an impossible puzzle. "I don't know how to let it go." "Neither did I," Peterson said. "But I'll tell you something I learned too late. The manuscript wins not when you fail to solve it. It wins when it consumes you, when it becomes more important than everything else, when you sacrifice your real life for the chance to be the person who cracks it." After he hung up, Davis sat in the dark for a long time. She could hear Michael's soft snoring from the bedroom, the house settling around her, the normal sounds of the life she'd been neglecting. The manuscript had beaten her, just like it had beaten everyone else. The question was whether she'd recognize defeat before it was too late, or whether she'd keep going until she ended up like Voynich, dying still believing the answer was just out of reach. Like Friedman, spending decades on a puzzle with no solution. Like Peterson, waking up decades later to realize what she'd sacrificed. The choice, she realized, was entirely hers. And she had no idea what to do. The breaking point came 6 months later, in a way Davis hadn't anticipated. She'd convinced herself she could manage both her obsession and her life, maintain the appearance of normalcy while still working on the manuscript in stolen hours. But obsession doesn't work that way. It doesn't respect boundaries or compromises. It grows in the spaces you try to reserve for other things, until there's nothing left. Michael found her in the study at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday, the night before Emma's high school graduation. Davis was hunched over her laptop, cross-referencing botanical illustrations with medieval medical texts, completely unaware of the time. "Lisa," his voice was quiet but firm, "we need to talk." She looked up, disoriented. The study was a disaster. Empty coffee cups, printouts scattered across every surface, her notebooks covering the floor. When had it gotten this bad? "Is it morning already?" "It's 4 a.m. Emma's graduation is in 12 hours. You haven't slept in 2 days, as far as I can tell. Your office called yesterday. They want to know when you're coming back. That was 3 weeks ago, and you still haven't responded." Davis rubbed her eyes. They felt gritty, burning. "I just need to finish this section. The pharmaceutical drawings, they might connect to—" "No." Michael sat down across from her, and something in his expression made her stomach clench. "I can't watch this anymore. Emma can't watch this. Jackson asked me last week if you were going to be okay. He's 17, Lisa. He shouldn't have to worry about whether his mother is losing her mind." "I'm not losing my mind. I'm researching." "You're disappearing. The woman I married, the mother my kids know, she's been replaced by someone who cares more about a 600-year-old book than her own family." He paused. "I love you, but I can't compete with an obsession. None of us can." Davis wanted to argue, wanted to explain that this was important, that she was close to understanding something fundamental. But the words died when she looked at Michael's face. Really looked at it. The exhaustion, the sadness, the resignation. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to choose. Either you walk away from this manuscript and come back to us, or you keep going and lose everything else." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been patient. God knows I've tried to understand. But I can't lose you to this thing. I won't." After he left, Davis sat alone in her study as dawn light began filtering through the curtains. She could hear Michael moving around upstairs, getting ready for the day. Emma would be up soon, excited about graduation, despite her mother's absence. Jackson would make breakfast, probably, because he'd learned to take care of himself when his mother stopped noticing. She looked at the walls covered in manuscript pages, the red yarn connecting impossible plants to unreadable text, the notebooks full of theories that had led nowhere, 20 months of work, thousands of hours, and she was exactly where she'd started. No closer to understanding, no closer to solving it. Just like Voynich, just like Friedman, just like Peterson. The thought came unbidden. What if there was one more option? One more expert who might succeed where humans had failed? In 2018, artificial intelligence had advanced to the point where neural networks could translate between languages they'd never been explicitly taught. Google's language models could process millions of texts simultaneously, identifying patterns invisible to human analysis. If the manuscript was indeed language, even encoded language, AI might recognize something humans couldn't. Davis reached out to a colleague at MIT who specialized in computational linguistics. Within weeks, they'd arranged for the manuscript to be analyzed by one of the most sophisticated language models in existence. A neural network trained on every known human language, capable of identifying linguistic structures at a level of complexity no human mind could match. The AI processed the entire manuscript in 47 minutes. Its conclusion arrived in a technical report that Davis read standing in her kitchen, Emma's graduation photo on the wall behind her, a reminder of the ceremony she'd barely attended. Analysis complete. Text exhibits statistical properties consistent with natural language. No match found to any language family in training data. Probabilistic modeling suggests consistent grammatical structure, but cannot identify linguistic category. Recommendation: insufficient data to determine if text represents actual language or sophisticated artificial construct designed to mimic linguistic properties. In other words, the most advanced artificial intelligence in human history couldn't read it either. But there was something else in the report that made Davis's blood run cold. A note from the lead researcher. Unusual finding. The text appears to actively resist pattern recognition. Each time our model attempted to establish consistent rules, exceptions would appear that invalidated the pattern. This behavior is statistically improbable in natural language. It suggests either 1. Extreme linguistic complexity beyond current AI capabilities, or 2. Deliberate construction to resist decryption. Davis read that paragraph 5 times. Deliberately constructed to resist decryption. Not just difficult to read. Designed not to be read. She thought about Peterson's words. It's protecting itself, or protecting us. What kind of knowledge would someone go to such elaborate lengths to make unreadable? What information was so dangerous that it needed to be encoded in a way that would defeat not just human intelligence, but artificial intelligence 5 centuries later? Or was the unreadability itself the point? Was the manuscript meant to consume anyone who tried to understand it? A trap disguised as knowledge, pulling in the brilliant and the curious and the obsessed, offering just enough hints of meaning to keep them hooked while never delivering answers? Davis closed the report and walked to the bathroom. She needed to splash water on her face, clear her head, think about this logically. When she looked in the mirror, she stopped breathing. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Hair unwashed for days, pulled back in a messy knot. Dark circles under her eyes so pronounced they looked like bruises. Cheekbones too prominent because she'd forgotten to eat regularly. Expression hollow, haunted, manic. She looked exactly like the description Peterson had given of himself in 1987. Exactly like the photographs of Voynich in his final years. Exactly like every other person who'd let this manuscript consume them. Davis gripped the sink, her hands shaking. 20 months, that's all it had taken. 20 months to go from respected scholar to this hollow-eyed obsessive who'd missed her daughter's graduation because she was chasing patterns that didn't exist in a book that couldn't be read. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sandra. "How are you doing? Haven't heard from you in weeks. Starting to worry." Davis looked at the phone, then back at the mirror. 2 paths stretched ahead of her. She could see them both clearly now. Path 1. Continue. Keep researching, keep theorizing, keep convincing herself she was close to a breakthrough. Watch Michael leave. Watch her kids grow up without her. Lose her position at the academy. Spend the next 20, 30, 40 years like Peterson did, sacrificing everything for a puzzle that would never be solved. End up old and bitter and alone, with nothing to show for it but boxes of failed theories. Path 2. Stop. Walk away. Choose her actual life over this beautiful, impossible mystery. Accept that some questions didn't have answers, that some books weren't meant to be read, that not knowing could be okay. It should have been an easy choice. But obsession doesn't let go easily. Even staring at her own hollowed-out reflection, part of her whispered, "Just a few more months. Just try one more approach. You're so close. Don't give up now." She understood then what Peterson had tried to tell her. The manuscript didn't just defeat you intellectually. It made you believe defeat was impossible. It made you think you were special, different, the one who would finally crack it, right up until you woke up decades later and realized what you'd sacrificed. Davis pulled out her phone and texted Sandra. "I need to come to Yale, one last time. Can you arrange access?" "Of course. When?" "Tomorrow, but not to study it, to say goodbye." The climate-controlled vault felt colder than Davis remembered. Or maybe she was just noticing it now, after months of tunnel vision. Sandra waited quietly as Davis approached the manuscript one final time. It looked exactly as it had 20 months earlier. Beautiful, mysterious, utterly confident in its incomprehensibility. Those plants that couldn't exist, that script no one could read, that perfect, pristine vellum that had survived 600 years while the people who studied it crumbled into dust. "I'm not going to open it," Davis said quietly. Sandra nodded, understanding. "I came to tell it that it won. That I'm done." Davis touched the protective cover gently, not removing it. "Whatever you are, whatever knowledge you're protecting or trap you're setting, you beat me. Just like you beat everyone else." She thought about Voynich, dying in 1930, still unsure if his discovery was real or hoax. About Friedman, 3 decades of the world's greatest cryptographic mind leading nowhere. About Peterson, broken and bitter, warning others away from the same mistake he'd made. "I think I understand now," Davis continued, speaking more to herself than to Sandra. "You're not meant to be solved. You're a test, not a test of intelligence or perseverance, a test of wisdom. The wisdom to recognize when something isn't meant to be known, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes more destructive than ignorance." Sandra spoke carefully. "So you think it's protecting knowledge that's dangerous?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's protecting us from ourselves, from our inability to accept limits." Davis stepped back from the manuscript. The really terrifying thing? Someone in the 15th century understood that. Understood human nature well enough to create something that would consume anyone who tried to understand it. They knew exactly what they were doing. "Will anyone ever read it?" Davis considered this. "I don't know. Maybe in another 100 years, with technology we can't imagine. Or maybe it's designed to stay unreadable forever. Maybe that's the point. Some knowledge protected by being impossible to access." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you, Sandra, for trying to help, for being patient with me, for not giving up on me when I was giving up on everything else." "What will you do now?" "Go home, apologize to my family. Try to remember who I was before this thing got its hooks in me." Davis managed a weak smile. "And maybe write a paper about why the Voynich Manuscript should be left alone. Though nobody who needs that advice will listen to it." The drive back to Boston felt longer than usual. Davis used the time to think about what she would say to Michael, to Emma, to Jackson. How to explain that she'd finally chosen them over an impossible mystery. How to prove she meant it this time. When she got home, Michael was in the kitchen making dinner. He looked up when she entered, hope and fear warring in his expression. "I went to Yale," Davis said, "to say goodbye to the manuscript." "And?" "And I'm done, really done. Not, I'll take a break and come back to it done. Actually finished." She set her bag down. "You were right. About everything. I was disappearing, becoming someone else, someone our kids didn't recognize and I didn't want to be." Michael didn't move. "How do I know this is different from the other times you said you'd stop?" "Because I finally understand what Peterson tried to tell me. The manuscript doesn't win when you fail to solve it. It wins when it becomes more important than your real life. When you sacrifice everything for the chance to be special, to be the one who cracked the code." She moved closer. "I don't want it to win. I want my life back. What about your research? The academy? I'll go back. Do actual work on manuscripts that can be read. Contribute something real instead of chasing fantasies. She paused. And I'll write something about the Voynich Manuscript, not a solution, a warning, for the next person who thinks they're different. Michael studied her face for a long moment. Then he pulled her into a hug she hadn't realized how desperately she needed. That night, Davis took down all the manuscript pages from her study walls, boxed up her notebooks, stored everything in the attic where she wouldn't see it every day. She kept one photograph, a single page of botanical illustration, as a reminder. Not of what she'd almost discovered, but of what she'd almost lost. 3 years later, Davis published an article titled The Voynich Manuscript and the Wisdom of Not Knowing. It didn't attempt to solve the manuscript. Instead, it documented the pattern of obsession across a century, Voynich's desperate search for validation, Friedman's decades of futile work, Peterson's breakdown, her own near miss with the same fate. The conclusion was simple but hard-earned. Some mysteries were more valuable unsolved. Some questions protected us by remaining questions. The pursuit of knowledge was noble, but knowing when to stop pursuing was wiser. The article was largely ignored by the Voynich community. People still convinced they were close to solving it didn't want to hear about wisdom and acceptance. They wanted breakthroughs and solutions. Davis understood. She'd been exactly like them. But occasionally she received emails from scholars who'd started down the same path, who'd felt the manuscript's hooks sinking in, who'd recognized the warning signs before it was too late. Those emails made the article worth writing. And sometimes, late at night, she'd take out that single photograph of botanical illustration. Look at those impossible plants with their perfect, inexplicable detail. Feel the old curiosity stirring, whispering that maybe, just maybe, there was still something to discover. Then she'd put the photograph away and go to bed, grateful for the life she'd chosen over the mystery. The Voynich Manuscript still sits in Yale's Beinica Library, perfectly preserved in its climate-controlled vault. The vellum is as supple as the day Voynich found it, the ink as dark, the illustrations as vivid. Every few years, someone new announces they've cracked the code. A fresh theory, a novel approach, a breakthrough that will finally reveal the manuscript's secrets. The announcement generates excitement, articles, conferences. Then the theory falls apart under scrutiny. The pattern that seemed so clear dissolves. The breakthrough proves to be another illusion, and the manuscript remains unread. Perhaps it always will. Perhaps that's exactly what it was designed to do. In 2023, a young graduate student named Marcus Chen submitted a proposal to study the manuscript using quantum computing and neural networks more sophisticated than anything that existed when Davis made her attempt. His advisor forwarded the proposal to Davis, asking for her opinion. Davis wrote back, "The manuscript will defeat him too. Not because he's not smart enough or his technology isn't advanced enough, but because it was created to be unreadable. To consume the brilliant and curious and dedicated. To offer just enough hope to keep them hooked while never delivering answers." She paused, then added, "But he probably needs to learn that himself. We all do." The proposal was approved. Chen began his work with the confidence of someone who believed he was different from all the others who'd failed. Just like Voynich had been confident. Just like Friedman. Just like Peterson. Just like Davis. And the manuscript waited, patient and silent, already knowing how this story would end. Because after 600 years, it had learned that human curiosity was both our greatest strength and our most exploitable weakness. That we couldn't resist a mystery, even when the mystery was designed to destroy anyone who tried to solve it. The question wasn't whether the manuscript contained dangerous knowledge. The question was whether the manuscript itself was the dangerous knowledge. A demonstration that some things protected themselves not by hiding, but by being impossible to understand. That the pursuit of answers could be more destructive than living with questions. And that wisdom sometimes meant recognizing when to stop asking why. The manuscript turned no pages, made no sound, revealed nothing. It simply waited, as it had for 6 centuries, for the next curious mind to believe it was special, to believe it was different, to believe it could succeed where everyone else had failed. And when that person arrived, as someone always did, the manuscript would do what it had always done. It would win, not by keeping its secrets, but by making the secrets more important than everything else.